Though we're disappointed in not being able to do so this year, we are nevertheless very excited that we can come together virtually this afternoon for the second in our four-part series of conversations with lay leaders on how U.S. Catholicism is being transformed by new kinds of leadership, learning, and institutional life. Welcome back to those of you who joined us last week for the first session that kicked off the series, Catholic Women in Church Leadership. The title of our panel today is Modern and Just Catholic Education and Formation. We'll hear more about the session and its participants in just a moment, but I also want to remind you that our programming will continue on each of the next 2 Mondays. On October 19th, we'll host a session entitled A Reckoning of Catholic Institutions, and on October 26th, we'll discuss the future of community and sacramental life. Now remember that if you are registered and you're here and registered for today's session, you've already registered for all 4. And if you can't make it to all of our talks, you'll be able to find them on YouTube for viewing at your convenience. I also would like to take a moment to mention our Catholic in the Public Square honorees, who have also very generously agreed to help host these virtual events. Last week, we were happy to have Carrie A. Robinson on hand. Today, we're proud to welcome our other honoree, Amy R. Goldman. Amy is CEO and chair of GHR Foundation, a global philanthropy of service to people and their limitless potential for good. She's also a member of foundations and donors interested in Catholic activities. Amy serves on the board of Georgetown University and the University of St. Thomas, as well as Opus Holding, the Visitation School, Jesuit Refugee Service International Development Group, Mayo Clinic Leadership Council, and she is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In a moment, I'll be turning things over to Amy to introduce today's panel and participants. But first, I just want to offer this friendly reminder about our Commonweal events. They are free and open to the public, and they wouldn't be possible without our readers and subscribers. The support and encouragement we get from friends and readers of Commonweal are truly indispensable, especially at times like this. If our independent lay-run voice matters to you, we invite you to support us with a tax-deductible donation. Just see the donate link in the chat feature or go to our website. And if you don't do so already, please consider subscribing to the magazine, join our email newsletter list, listen to our podcast, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Your help not only allows us to bring you events like these, but it's a big part in everything else we do. I also have to note the hard work of the staff here at Commonweal in helping put this series of events together, especially our audience development team, Milton Javier Bravo, Gabriella Wilkie, and Adriana Melnick, along with our publisher, Tom Baker. And I want to thank all of those who've agreed to take part, moderators and panelists, in this thoughtful and enlightening series of discussions. So now, without further ado, I hand things over to Amy Goldman.
Thank you, Dominic, and hello, everyone. I'm grateful to be able to join you today, if virtually, for this important conversation, and kudos to Commonweal for putting on this fantastic series. I want to begin by thanking all of the sponsors for this event for your support, and also thank all of our viewers for being here today. I truly hope we can gather for our Commonweal's 2021 Conversation Dinner. But today, we've come together for what's certain to be an enlightening panel, Modern and Just Catholic Education and Formation. It's intended to examine how educators and parents are being challenged to reimagine creative and just methods of learning that can meet the current and future needs of Catholic education and formation. As I reflect on the pressing, new and enduring challenges our nation faces, economic and health crises, systemic racism, increased polarization, there's a critical role for the tenets of Catholic social teaching to play in preparing the future. I believe now more than ever, Catholic education has an accelerated need to reimagine how it might provide a solid moral foundation at greater scale and with increased accessibility. So leading us in this conversation today, we're so pleased to have today's moderator, Dr. Michael Papard, Professor of Theology at Fordham University. A teacher and a scholar, Dr. Papard's primary work brings to light the meanings of the New Testament and other Christian materials in their social, political, artistic, and ritual contexts, He received his PhD in religious studies from Yale University, with prior degrees from Yale Divinity School, its Institute of Sacred Music, and the University of Notre Dame. He frequently offers commentary on current affairs at the nexus of religion, politics, and culture for Commonweal, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and PBS. So thank you all once again for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you now, Michael.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be moderating this discussion, and I want to get quickly to the brilliant insights of the panelists. And I'd like to start, if we could, with Molly. So Molly Wilson O'Reilly is editor-at-large at Commonweal, and she is also a columnist. And Molly, as we think about the different phases of education, I think about the fact that, like so many parents of school-age kids across the country, for many months, you've been managing a 3-ring circus at your house. In your case, 4-ring circus. And you wrote about this in Commonweal last week. You wrote about the return of your children to their Catholic school. But you wrote that you don't want this to be held up as a false contrast to supposed failures of public education. And let me read a quote. You said, quote, "Catholics should be standing in solidarity with all our neighbors as we do our best to cope with this crisis. We degrade our witness when we allow Catholic schools to be used in a propaganda campaign against public services or against an honest reckoning with the facts." So now, as someone with both on-the-ground experience and a bird's-eye view of Catholic education as an editor of Commonweal, what do you think are the ways that Catholic schools can respond to today's unique challenges?
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, my perspective at this moment is very much that of an elementary school parent and also a graduate. I went to Catholic elementary school myself. And so I'm very grateful to be able to say that for the first time, all of my kids are in school at the same time together all day. And their Catholic elementary school is able to do that, as I wrote in that column, both because it has the space and the small enough class size, and because it has the very dedicated principal and faculty who are making it work. But also because private schools don't have a lot of the concerns that public schools do. And it's really important to keep that in mind, it's not a one-to-one comparison at all. So when it came to choosing Catholic schools for our kids, my husband and I really wanted them to have the experience of community, of being raised in a community of faith, and also community minded. And that was something that we both felt like we took away from our own experience of Catholic school. And I think that that's the real treasure that Catholic grade schools have in all of their various circumstances, because they are so different depending on where they are and who their students are. But they all have a mission to build community and to teach not just the fundamentals of the faith, but also what it looks like to live that in an everyday context. Because the very project of making a Catholic school work, with all of the creativity that it takes and all of the sacrifice and the hustle that it involves, is a community building project, that it requires sacrifices from everyone, investment from everyone. And then because it's based in the faith, it gives a common ground to unite and inspire at its best. And so I know at my kids' school, the principal and the teachers and also the curriculum itself keeps calling the students to look around them and see the problems in the world and the problems in their community, and ask what they can do to respond and how they can use the education that they're getting to respond now and also in the future. So I think that's the big challenge of this moment for all of us, and especially for schools, is perceiving and being aware of the challenges that everyone's experiencing, especially because this pandemic has been a challenge to so many different groups of people in so many different ways, all at the same time. And what schools have to ask, and what Catholic schools especially have to ask, is, are we forming students in a way that makes them conscious of their neighbors and makes them seek to be of service in their community? Or are we teaching them to think of themselves as set apart and superior and even embattled? Because solidarity is a core Catholic value, and solidarity can be really threatened by instability, which is something that we're seeing play out in so many ways in our political context right now. And so for Catholic schools, The New York Archdiocese has been held up as a success story, but at the same time, 20 Catholic schools in the New York Archdiocese closed for good in June. And the rest are scrambling to be on a solid financial footing, even more than usual. And any Catholic school parent knows that they always are. So my concern is that that need for funding and that longing for stability will tempt Catholic school communities to play into that boo to the public schools framework that the New York Post, for example, is always pushing. Because whatever Catholic schools' mission is, they're not supposed to be a replacement for public schools. That isn't what they're intended to do. And so if advocating for funding for Catholic schools means advocating for even less adequate funding for public schools, then that's a real failure of the solidarity that we're supposed to be representing. So I think Catholic schools have a unique set of gifts that they can bring to the challenges of this moment in terms of educating kids for community and also keeping them safe. But they also really need to work to make sure that they're educating children in a way that demonstrates concern for the common good and solidarity instead of encouraging them to pull away.
Thank you so much for introducing a lot of important issues there about access to education, about the value, the virtue of solidarity, which may stand in tension with pursuits of excellence and, as you say, superiority in some cases. I think we'll return to a number of these issues throughout the hour, and we'll come back to you, Molly, when those come up again. I want to turn next to Hassan Ospino, who is a professor of Hispanic ministry and religious education at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. And I won't read everyone's full bio because they're provided there in the chat for you, but you can check those out as you want. And Professor Ospino, you've done extensive research on curriculum of Catholic education in general, and you've also had a special emphasis on Hispanic and Latino Catholics. And I'm curious, as you see things from your perspective, what are the challenges that we face in providing an education that is just, that is distinctive, that is truth-telling, that is oriented toward discipleship? And I'm also curious, I guess at part B, as someone who speaks regularly to both English and Spanish-speaking church cultures, I'm wondering in what ways your answers to such questions depend on the audience that you engage with.
Thank you, Michael, for that question. And I mean, it's a pleasure also to be part of this dialogue, alongside with Molly, Cecilia, and Elsie, and definitely you. I mean, Molly certainly provided me with a number of ideas that I hope that we get to discuss down the road, during this hour. But let me get to your question. I think that it is imperative, that we remember why we have Catholic educational institutions. At the end of the day, that's the core question. If we're going to be in the business of Catholic schools, in the business of Catholic universities, we need to understand, why we have it. And Catholic education is ultimately a ministry of the church, meaning a ministry of the community of disciples of Jesus Christ, rooted in the gospel, in the wisdom of the gospel. So if that's the starting point, I think that, any attempt to co-opt or to manipulate what we do and how we do Catholic education, needs to be placed in check. Catholic schools in this country, in the United States of America, and not only in the United States, all throughout the world, have been established primarily with two main purposes. When we go back to the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, that pretty much mandated or asked every parish to establish a Catholic school, it was very clear why we were to have Catholic schools. And eventually, this echoed how we ended up with so many Catholic universities and institutes and so on. Reason number one, we wanted to give children, our Catholic children, primarily our Catholic families, the best possible education available. And at the time when many Catholic schools, emerged, well, I mean, many of them were not, public schools were not in the best position. They were not, they didn't have the best faculty, the best programs, and so on. So Catholic schools, as a matter of fact, raised the bar, and Catholic universities, as they have evolved, in general, are very strong institutions. We got very good name Catholic institutions. And the second purpose of Catholic educational institutions, has been, maintain the Catholic identity. I mean, it's just as simple as that. We want to do things in a way that is truly Catholic. Now, the context in which Catholic schools and Catholic education in the US, is done comparing, for instance, the end of the 19th century and early 20th century has changed dramatically, I mean, for instance, we went from pretty much educating almost only Catholics to educating a growing number of non-Catholics, non-Catholic Christians and even non-Christians. The sisters, and the brothers and priests who were omnipresent in these institutions are almost absent. In half a century, we went from 97%, mostly sisters and a few clergy, a few brothers, down to about 1 or 2%, which is amazing. And we have more lay women and men who have stepped up to the plate, and definitely with strong commitments to Catholicism, but in a different way, not just like the sisters. And so also that we see these days is, our Catholic schools and universities compete, with other institutions, whether it's faith-based institutions or secular institutions, in a marketplace that I want to call brutal. I mean, it's like, if you don't compete, you are out of the game. And we already see this in Catholic schools. I mean, in the 1970s, we used to have more than 13,000 Catholic schools. Today, we're down to the low 6,000s, and unfortunately, we have lost many of these schools. So I think that I want to provide these numbers, because I think that in the midst of these changes, we need to ask ourselves, are we keeping our Catholic identity? I mean, are we doing Catholic school, Catholic university education with a Catholic view? And that requires asking important questions. For instance, these days we're filling our schools with, anybody who can come, we want them to come to our schools. But the question is, does filling the schools with students from any way of life, and in many cases with students that, are the ones who can afford Catholic education, make our schools the most adequate places to learn the Catholic tradition and actually embody, what it means to be Catholic, Or do we run the risk of relegating Catholic values to campus ministry or religion classes primarily, so we can compete for funding, for prestige, And let's be honest, some of the best top-notch Protestant universities in this country actually went through that process long time ago, not long ago. And what was sacrificed in that process was precisely the religious identity. So I think that, when our nation and our church are faced with critical conversations about immigration, race, poverty, life issues like abortion and war and the death penalty, one wants to look at graduates from Catholic education, and I mean Catholic schools and universities, to see how they engage in these conversations. And I got to tell you, Michael, the more I move around and the more I listen to Catholic educators and engage, what we get is a complex picture. There are many graduates from Catholic schools actually who have not received enough of the Catholic intellectual tradition that will help them to make value judgments, that reflect the integrity of Catholicism, and that's a problem. There are many other graduates who present elements of political or philosophical ideology as Catholic, and then we are cheapening what Catholic identity, even in situations when those elements actually contradict the larger Catholic tradition. I'm not going to blame Catholic schools here, I'm not going to say that that they are bad or Catholic universities are bad because I actually teach in one of them, and my children go to Catholic schools and so on, But we need to keep in mind that Catholic schools and universities need to regularly look at their curriculum and their faculty and their administrators to assess how honestly they are educating for justice, for truth, and for discipleship in a Catholic way. I'll leave the question on Latinos and other groups for the conversation forward, because I want to connect it to what Molly was saying earlier.
Thank you so much. You gave us a lot to think about there, connecting to the deep history of these issues in the United States. And I want to turn now to Cecilia, who's a professor of theology at Loyola Marymount University, and she is known for her work in political theology and her work on behalf of the Latinx community. And Cecilia, I want to get back a little bit to talking about and thinking about the pandemic that we're in. When I asked Molly that question about the crisis of the day, I want to ask you about the crisis of the day in a different perspective. Student and teacher of the New Testament, I think a lot about this word apocalypse, the Greek word apocalypse, as a revelation, an unveiling, a pulling back and letting us see the truth. But we use the word apocalypse also as a word to capture a horror, maybe a horror that comes at a pivotal moment of time. And so we have this horrible crisis that stopped the regular flow of time in our lives, and also has revealed a lot of painful truths about our society. Prior to the pandemic, you wrote about some of these revelations. You wrote about, quote, revelations of corruption surrounding who has access to education. That's from one of your columns for America magazine. And recently you've spoken about how this pandemic has caused your own vocation as a theological educator to become more powerfully political. And so I'm hoping we can invite you to tell us more about what you mean about those convictions.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Of course, exactly as you say, right? The pandemic has just thrown light on inequities and corrupted systems that many of us had been writing about for a long time and agitating about. I guess that the opportunity of this moment is that we have a lot more people paying attention. And that's a key, right? Even this moment right now, I rarely get to be on a panel with two of my fellow Latinx scholars. So that's just amazing in itself. But, I'm a theologian, so I go back to the theological implications of the question of education, because I think Catholic can't be a label. It has to be a following of the gospel, as we have heard Molly and Hassan talk about, that has particular content to it. So I'm just going to go through a few of these things that I see as relating particularly to faith and education together. The first thing is that we can't be church without having the voices of all of God's people. And that means God's most marginalized people, God's most vulnerable people. And if our education is not intentional about making it possible for them to join the conversation, then we are not in any way embodying the gospel or even reflecting on the gospel, because we don't have their voices within that. Right? And so that goes to a second point, which is education allows us to stop talking about other people and lets them talk about themselves. We need their stories. We need their experiences. We need what we call lo cotidiano, what the daily moments of life are revealing of God's work in the world. If people are shut out from education, they can't in any way help us to see all of this, right? A third thing that we need to pay attention to is following the money. The present educational systems in the Western world, but really, let's just say globally, are built upon the idea of creating permanent underclasses. We are dependent on having people whose educational level will force them to do manual labor, will force them to do what we're now calling essential work, because they have no other options. And we're seeing it so painfully right now. I hear it from my students. You know, my dad is a driver, and he's taking, you know, a risk every single day. My mom works at a meat factory where there was a pandemic blow up, right? They don't get to sit behind the screen and have conversations, right? So how insidious is a system that's predicated on a permanent underclass? Well, how do we undo that system? We undo it with education, right? A fourth thing is that Catholic education cannot be synonymous with Catholic schools. Catholic education has to be about a way of being in the world that is predicated on radical love of neighbor. So for me, Catholic education means that we get involved in every facet politically that affects education in the local level, in our neighborhood, in our city, in our state, nationally, and globally, right? As Catholic people who want to ensure that we're loving our neighbor. And so if, exactly as Molly said, if money is being siphoned off public schools, then that we cannot allow for that. If we have schools that have been set up now as just private elite schools with a Catholic name, that is not Catholic education, right? So our involvement politically in ensuring that God's beloved people all have access to education as an intrinsic right has to be at the forefront of ever calling ourselves Catholic and putting education in that word, right? And so I know that I like to be particular, especially because when I teach my graduate theology students, I have lots of teachers, community organizers, priests, sisters, etc. And so I say there are particular things that we can do. So for me, right, so this is where the political comes in, right? For me, access for undocumented students to education is primordial. And if you are anywhere where you have a Catholic university or a Catholic high school, prod them to find out, do you have any scholarships set aside for undocumented students? Programs for students who are the first generation to go to school. In universities, what we call first to go, right? First gen. Are they adequately funded? Do they have the support that they need? That is caring for our neighbor. Programs that support master's and doctoral students that are coming from underserved communities. Right now, right here with 3 Catholic theologians here, you almost have like an incredible amount of people from the entire Catholic Latinx theologian population of the United States, because there's so few of us. There's so few of us. So we need programs that are going to support us, like the Hispanic Theological Initiative and other programs, and they need support to get students from that elementary classroom all the way to being sitting in a university setting and helping our community to be better at what we need to be better. And then we need to build up political alliances. We need to make alliances with all of the groups, with other faith communities, political communities, NGOs, all of the groups that are working on education and educational access and educational justice.
Wow, thank you so much, Cecilia. It's a really powerful exhortation to look, to not just look at our screens, to not just look at the words in Commonweal magazine, but to look in our own communities and seek out those ways that we can support the undocumented and increase access and be powerfully political. Thank you so much. I want to turn to our last our last panelist, Elsie Miranda. Elsie Miranda is Director of Accreditation for the Association of Theological Schools, rounding out a career as a professor of practical theology at Barry University. And Elsie, you have a different perspective, a different view on the world of education than the rest of us do right now. And your position, it seems like you'd see a very wide array of types of theological education and also adult faith formation. Now, Catholics, we know, are called to form their consciences. That's a word we hear a lot, a phrase we hear a lot from official teaching. Form our consciences so that we might be prepared to live out our faith amid whatever circumstances may arise in life. And as Catholics mature to adulthood, the old answers that we learned in a textbook or from our 8th grade teacher or from a catechism, those answers can begin to fail us. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us in your words, how do you diagnose this problem of faith formation and a maturity into Catholic education? Are there models of Catholic formation of conscience that you think can transform us into mature students of Christ, mature disciples of Christ, and lay leaders of the church, which are, of course, increasingly needed? To unmute yourself there, Elsie. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought I was being unmuted. So thank you so much for that intro, and it's a pleasure and an honor to follow my esteemed colleagues. I'd like to just acknowledge that my worldview has changed dramatically since I started the work of accreditation, and it's made me fundamentally much more aware and appreciative of my Catholic formation. Because I'm so often surrounded by those who are not Catholic. So I'd like to touch back on some of the things that Hofsman and Cecilia have said. Relationship to Catholic identity and Catholic formation. So often I look at the catechetical models and the formation processes that Catholic churches have kind of imposed upon a generation of young men and women and even adults, using this catechetical model that tries to ingrain a person into this sense of who we are by virtue of what we believe, and this kind of intellectual assent to a way of being is good. But I think in my experience, it has left us kind of somewhat disembodied. And we forget that we come from an incarnational faith. We have the gift of understanding that God's grace comes into the world as a human being, and that the emulation of Christ and the gospel is part of what we are aiming for when we talk about formation in Catholic education. And in my experience, we've failed our community miserably, because in some ways we detached the narrative of our tradition. Like Cecilia was saying, how do we listen to the stories of faith in the here and now that connect to the narrative of the gospel, so that people can participate in the Christ event and not have it be like a historical phenomenon that is disengaged from their daily life. And so I see that in some ways, the Protestants who focused so heavily on a scriptural formation, they lack the ritual and the richness of what we understand to be a sacramental faith. So in some ways, we're both impoverished, and I don't know that anyone is doing a really good job of engaging the imagination today to see how young men and women can be formed to integrate the tradition, the gospel narrative with action, to recognize that how we form our conscience is not, I mean, in some ways, Catholic, let's be honest, I think the formation of conscience in many ways in Catholic circles is like the good news nobody wants to talk about.
people ask, well, what is a conscience? Let me go find out what Father thinks, or, and that kind of old school clerical model for doing what is right and good and just and holy and merciful is not helping this community any longer. I don't know if it ever did really, but if we go back to Gaudium et Spes 16, the way I have rewritten that for an inclusive community is that in the depths of our conscience, a person detects a law that is not imposed upon us, but rather that it rises up within us, summoning us to love and to do what is good and to shun what is evil. God has written this law upon our hearts. To obey this law is the very dignity of our humanity, and by this law we shall be judged. And I think that in this particular historical moment, as Cecilia talks about, the political implications of our faith, how we understand our responsibility to act with a sense of dignity, to love what is good and to do what is good, requires a faith formation that doesn't go looking for Father to tell us what is right, but that it requires a depth of spirituality where we learn to be one with God, that the sacrament of Eucharist is not something we just receive, but it's something that we're called to live. And in that, we learn that sometimes following the law that is imposed upon us might actually be a participation in what is evil. And following the law that is in our heart is actually a call to prophetic justice, which may indeed get us in trouble with Father, but fundamentally is what is calling us to be good. And in that, I think, is where our sense of justice and formation for Catholic identity is rooted. And I timed myself, so my 5 minutes are up.
Thank you so much, Elsie. From the four panelists, we've heard about a wide array of the issues that face us, and I know that each of us would have follow-up questions and comments to each of us on the screen. But we have many attendees here, hundreds, and we have a lot of questions that have come in. And I'd like to pose one of them to open to the panel. I think it's one that anyone might have a way into discussing. As teachers, when we assess other teachers, we try not to focus on what the teacher did, right, or what the teacher is doing, but what the students are learning as a way of assessing the effectiveness of education. And if we think about Catholic education and Catholic formation in this way, one of the people in the chat asks about the lack of basic understanding of Catholic social teaching that exists in the Catholic pews and in Catholic schools. And so this person says that many of his or her fellow boomer generation Catholics seem to lack this basic understanding, and is wondering, how do we improve on that? Some people call Catholic social teaching the best kept secret of the Catholic Church, right? And so I'm wondering if from the four of you, if you've had experience with attempting to do this, or is that how you see the problem? I'm just kind of want to throw it open to the panel.
Well, for me, one of the hopes is that we broaden graduate education so that we have a lot of the people in lay leadership all around our communities who will get a solid and good preparation. But we also need that in our curricula. And so, and we need to support the access to graduate education. But I'm often struck by having a deacon, for instance, who will be applying to our university and realizing that whatever we can train him to be able to just really access the richness of Catholic social teaching will have major repercussions with all of the communities that he works with, that he preaches to. So I think education, again, and just making it as accessible as possible, inviting as many people as possible into it, is one way that we need to do this.
If I could chime in on this, I think that the question, Michael, points to the dysfunctional separation that many Catholics have introduced or allowed ourselves to be introduced for us, separating Catholic social teaching from the rest of the life of the church. It just doesn't fit in my head when somebody says, I'm a Catholic social teaching person and I don't do liturgy. Or somebody says, I do Eucharistic adoration and I don't pay much attention to Catholic social teaching. And I'm thinking, at what point, did we start separating these dynamics, And I want to echo Cecilia's earlier comments on, the universality of Catholic education. Everything needs to be Catholic, and I would say that the same applies to Catholic social teaching. I mean, if you believe in Christ, if you receive the Eucharist, if you are pro-life, if you do the Eucharistic adoration, for goodness sake, you got to care about the immigrant, you got to care about the poor, you got to care about the mother who is single, I mean, how can you separate, those two? And I think that it's not that people don't understand what Catholic social teaching is about, because it's, to be honest with you, it's very commonsensical. You respect everybody, everybody's a child of God, you respect the dignity, you affirm people. The question is that we allowed ourselves to separate artificially what it means to be Catholic, from our responsibility towards the other.
Thank you. And I'd like to add to that, that in that separation, I think we well, let me just say that Catholic theological formation, even from the beginning, is about safety and belonging, to use Maslow's categories. And that safety net is I think is where we receive this formation that is tradition based. This is where I belong. This is what has formed my religious imagination. But the belonging piece factors into our sense of, my identity as a Catholic is something that that I am obedient to, and my identity as a Catholic is something that I'm responsible for. And there are many people who would like to separate that and say, well, I'm a good Catholic because I'm obedient. But at the end of the day, the question is, how is our Catholic faith measured by all the ways in which we take responsibility for living our faith and living that discipleship and calling out one another to service and to see again that the poor and the crucified are right here in our midst.
Several of the questions, Elsie, that I'm seeing get to your phrase, the clericalist default, the idea that people turn to Father for answers to these questions. And it strikes me that one of the issues that's bubbling up from under the surface of all of our comments is the role of the laity, the role of lay people in Catholic education at all levels. And, Hausman, you gave the statistics about 97% of the educators were sisters and in some cases brothers and priests, and it's down to just a couple percent. And those of us at the level of higher ed, of course, experience this as well. So I'm wondering, from all of our different contexts, what are some ideas do we have any ideas how to change that perspective in Catholic education, the default to clergy, the default to priests and nuns? What are our strategies for how to manage that? I know that's a difficult question and maybe the biggest question of Catholic identity in education, right? But I'm wondering what you see from your different perspectives on this question of clericalism and lay leadership.
I'd just like to say that we need the leadership of the church writ large to more forthrightly empower and recognize the leadership of women in the church. And in some ways, the silence on that is deplorable, because if we do not have legitimized power as laity, men and women, people keep looking for that authority. Like what grants us authority to speak as Catholics? It's not because I wear a habit. It's not because I don't have a collar. It's because of the integrity of our lives. And we have to have the Catholic imagination has to be expanded to recognize the authority that is in men and women who have lived faith and who call one another to living out that sense of discipleship. And you know what? When you look at the success that Bishop Barron has and EWTN, a lot of that is because they have learned how to use the media. They have learned how to use, cartoons, programming, movies, different ways of packaging the message and inspiring young men and women. And the alternative to that kind of dogmatic faith in using that medium hasn't been successful. We haven't done enough in that arena. And I think that's an area for growth that we really need to take advantage of. And frankly, I love Pope Francis, but he needs to say something more about, the power and responsibility of lay leaders.
Well, and for me, that goes back to having the tools. So when I have a group of students and we start learning how to have critical engagement with the tradition, how to look at the newspaper in one hand and the tradition in the other, how to address the moment. When we give them the tools, then they're ready to go out there as lay people and ask questions. And I am a big proponent that we need to just be fearless. We need to buttonhole the priest or deacon who just gave a terrible homily. At the end of that, when people are shaking hands, we take them aside and say, what was that? And I have done that. What was that? What was that about? Because that was demeaning to women, because that was demeaning to the poor, right? But I want my students to feel that they have the authority and the capacity to go and ask those questions. And how do we do that? Well, I teach them to gather the evidence. You need to know your tradition. You need to know your scripture. You need to know how to call them to task on what was just said, which is why for me and for great thinkers like Paul Ricoeur way before, education is the key to liberation. And the laity needs liberating. We need liberating out of this thumb, and women especially. We need to be able to say, no, you don't get to say that. And the only way that happens is with education.
If I could build, oh yeah, Molly, please.
I just wanted to say on the subject of women, especially in leadership, for me, Catholic grade school was and is a place where I see that lived out. And, it was because I went to a Catholic school where a lot of the teachers and the administrators were sisters and lay women. And my 4 sons now go to a school where leadership is almost entirely women and lay women. That feels really important to me. And that's how I knew that women could and did claim authority and claim leadership and fulfill leadership roles in the church, even when the hierarchy was saying, well, not so much. I mean, I knew different because I saw it from the time I was a little kid. So that's something I really value about especially at the elementary level, Catholic schools, is it's a place where women, including the moms, are really just doing the work.
If I could pivot based on something Cecilia said, it connects to one of the questions that I find pretty fascinating here in the chat. So here in the pandemic, most of our children are not learning in a regular way, whatever school they're going to, right? And many of them are learning in small groups. The learning pods is something it's been called. And so one of the attendees asks, when we're talking about reimagining Catholic education at all levels here, is it possible that we can think of small Christian community models, right? Think about, in Latin American theology, base communities where this education for liberating praxis happens. And of course, our Protestant sisters and brothers have a whole history of educating in small groups and small group faith formation that at least American Catholics have not usually been on board with, or it's not a part of the culture, at least not yet. Thinking about the pandemic plus that history, again, throwing it open to the whole panel, do you think that small Christian communities within the Catholic Church, small group learning pods of faith formation, is this one part of our future? How do you all see that?
I'll be brief. I would love to see that happen, but I think that the Catholic Church has to get over the sexualized focus of our formation, that kind of disembodies people as good and evil based on some kind of sexual paradigm, and really look more at the issue of power and authority and how we live into that kind of graced existence, and that'll take some undoing, but I think it's possible, and if that happens, then I think a base community would really be a beautiful model.
If I can chime in on this, I think it's already happening. What you're describing is already happening. Just look at the Latino communities, look at Asian communities, Black communities, Caribbean communities. We already see this type of education is happening. What the problem is that it's being ignored, because it's not mainstream, and very rarely what the energy of the Latino community makes it into a Catholic school or a Catholic university, or makes it into the standard of how a diocese actually organizes religious education, or a diocese organizes Catholic schools, no? And as a matter of fact, it's expected that Latinos and Asians and Black communities, African-American communities actually adjust to whatever standard models are, that are not working. We have to be honest. I'm openly critical about the K through 12 model for catechesis. It's not working. It's been many years in which the system has been faltering. There are places where they do it well, congratulations, but in most places it's not working. That is not simply working. So yes, it's already happening. My fear is that in an individualistic society like ours, those models that emerged in Latin America-based communities, small ecclesial communities, they require a communal perspective and understanding of faith and society, and that's going to be resisted. Period. It's going to be resisted. And the last thing that I want to say, perhaps some of my colleagues on this panel might disagree about, or may have different perspectives, but I see a lot of value in ecclesial movements. There are the apostolic movements. When run well, when done well, there's a lot of energy, and they are doing a catechesis and Catholic education that is fascinating. My critique might be perhaps sometimes when they get co-opted by, small agendas, but that happens pretty much to every group. But there's energy there.
Yeah, the thing that I would add is that we want to always keep an eye on education also, and not just faith formation, because I've been part of fantastically beautiful small base communities, and very often what I hear from the community members, that the Latino community members, is I never got to go to school. Can you teach me how I read this? Can you help me? Right. And I don't want us to small base communities to continue to bifurcate people who have skills from those who will talk about their faith. We need to integrate those so that the small base community, which is what I wanted to do with this community, was building up leadership from them. And for them to be able to build up leadership, we need to give them access to the education that everybody up at the top gets, right? But they're not supposed to need, because they can just share Bible passages. We really need to be very vigilant about that.
So I see that we're coming, unfortunately, short of time here up to the end. And with just a few minutes left, I would like to give each of the panelists a chance to give a closing thought, a closing word, a word of exhortation, or an observation based on our hour together. I often tell my students that one of the goals of a liberal arts education is to be able to say anything you want to say in any amount of time that you're given, right? So that if you can do it in one sentence, or you can do it in 1 hour, but to try to boil down your ideas. It's idealistic, I know, but we aim for it, I think, as educators. And so I'd like to go in order, maybe the way we started with Molly and then to Hoffman and around. But we've covered so many issues today. I've heard about accessibility to education, community formation, the challenges of Catholic assimilation to the surrounding culture, and whether the distinctiveness of identity is there to be passed on, concerns about the very practical issues of closures of schools and how that's affected Catholic education. We've heard about education as a ministry. Disciple, of course, means student, after all, this term. Discipleship means to be a good student. We've heard about the very powerfully political aspects of education today, and what the pandemic has revealed about the fault lines in American society and the challenges in the church for those who are kept to the margins, sometimes intentionally kept to the margins, and that only a radical love of neighbor can bring us back to our true Catholic identity. So I want to just thank everyone for all of those comments, and ask if you could leave us with a final thought or exhortation about Catholic education today. Maybe first to Molly.
So the talk about clericalism and about leadership, I guess, is what I'm left thinking about. And I think because there are fewer priests than there were, even when we were all young, and because the school models are changing. So the school my kids go to is technically a regional school. So it's on the grounds of a parish, but it's not just funded by that parish. I feel like the authority of father as being overall is already receding in a way that I think is healthy. And so I hope that my kids will leave their Catholic education at whatever point that ends, conversant in the traditions and that feeling of comfort and belonging. They know the prayers and they know how to say grace in a group of Catholics, but also feeling that they have an ability to discern and to understand and to take those tools and make decisions, and not just to follow directions and defer to whoever the closest priest is when they have a decision to make. So if Catholic schools are giving kids those tools at whatever age and whatever level, I think that they're doing something really important and valuable.
I'm gonna use my few seconds to share 3 statistics, and from there I will connect them to a pending thought that was left at the beginning of the conversation raised by Molly. 60% of about 60% of Catholics who are school age in the United States of America are Hispanic. We know that 94% of Hispanic children go to public schools. More than 70% of Hispanic Catholic children go to underperforming underperforming public schools. So what I want to say with these 3 numbers is that advocating for public schools is a must for every Catholic today if we care about the future of Catholic children and their families and the future of the church. It's a non-negotiable.
Absolutely, Hoffman. And I just want to do an exhortation. Get out of your spaces. Get to know people who are different from you. Let their needs send you out to change the stuff that needs to change.
And I would like to close with the invitation to really learn to listen and really learn to see and really learn to be faithful, so that that law that is written upon our hearts, not imposed upon, but given to us by God, is something that not only forms us to be better human beings for one another, but for the planet. And I do hope and pray that in the context of our own lives, that we might say yes with courage to the call of God.
Amen. Thank you so much to Elsie, to Cecilia, to Hausman, to Molly. Of course, none of this would be possible without the readers of Commonweal and Commonweal Associates, so we're grateful to them as well. To our honorees, Carrie and Amy, thank you so much. And please, if you enjoyed this conversation, both the exhortations, but also the very deep challenges, that is the experience of being a Commonweal reader and being a Commonweal participant, is that we feel uplifted on one page and challenged on the next to live out our faith more powerfully and more locally. So if you liked what you heard, or if you felt challenged by what you heard, hopefully both, you can tune in to 2 more of these sessions coming up. And thank you so much for being here.